May 12, 1945, the guns had fallen silent, but the echoes of war still haunted every street. In the shattered town of Wiesbaden, Germany, 19-year-old Ilse Hartmann stood in what was once her father's pharmacy, sifting through debris and ash. The air still smelled of burnt paper and chemical dust. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then silence. She had grown used to silence. It had been 3 days since the artillery stopped, 3 days since the Nazi banners were torn down, and 3 days since she realized the Reich that had defined her entire existence was gone. But when she heard the low growl of engines approaching, instinct returned. Trucks, foreign trucks, American. Her mother's hand clamped onto her arm, nails biting into her skin. "Stay behind me," she whispered sharply. "Don't look, don't speak." Ilse froze as the convoy rolled into view. Everything she'd ever been taught told her this was the moment to fear most the arrival of the enemy. But the soldiers who stepped out of those vehicles weren't the men her teachers or propaganda posters had warned her about. They weren't the white gangsters and criminals from American caricatures. They were black soldiers, a sight that didn't fit into any category her world had ever allowed. For years, Nazi education had painted black people as less than human, as dangerous, as incapable of civilization. Her biology textbooks, Rassenkunde des deutschen Volkes, had charts proving it, or so her teacher said. Her instructor, Frau Dressler, once told the class that Negroes are driven by instinct, not intellect. Ilse had believed her. Everyone did. But now, standing in the ruins of her home, she saw one of these so-called subhumans, a man in a dusty uniform, a sergeant with kind eyes, slowly approach with both hands raised. "We have food," he said in broken German. "Medicine? You need help?" The words cracked something open inside her. His voice wasn't harsh or threatening. It was gentle, careful.
Halt still!
It wasn't supposed to be possible.
Wir müssen hier
Her
weg.
mother pulled her back, muttering, "It's a trick." But then the sergeant placed a crate on the ground,
rations.
tinned rations,
Go ahead and take
clean water, and stepped away, leaving space. Her younger brother, hollow-cheeked from weeks of hunger, darted forward before she could stop him. The soldiers didn't react. One of them smiled faintly, gesturing that it was safe.
Kind, ich vermisse
That
dich
night,
so
Ilse's
sehr.
family ate in silence. The food was bland, but it felt miraculous. Her mother wept quietly between bites. "I don't understand," she kept saying. "I don't understand." Neither did Ilse, because if these men, these supposed monsters, could act with such humanity, then what else had been a lie? Across Western Germany, similar moments unfolded. The 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, had rolled through France and into Germany with brutal efficiency. Behind them came the 92nd Infantry Division, the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, and others, all segregated black units. To most Germans, the idea of black soldiers was inconceivable. In Nazi ideology, they weren't even part of the same species of man. Yet, in the spring of 1945, these men were the face of liberation. In Babenhausen, a 28-year-old woman named Marguerite Schiller cowered in a farmhouse attic with 5 others. They'd heard stories of Soviet troops, women raped, men shot, children taken. When American boots sounded on the stairs, the women braced for the worst. But when the door opened, the soldier who appeared didn't fit any story she knew. He was a young black man in a U.S. uniform. For a moment, Marguerite thought she was hallucinating. The contradiction between his skin and the uniform between propaganda and reality was too much to process. The soldier, Corporal James Thompson from Detroit, saw the terror in their eyes and stepped back immediately. Moments later, a Jewish interpreter appeared, a refugee who had fled Germany in 1938. "You are civilians," he told them gently. "We will not harm you. We only check for wounded." Marguerite watched the corporal's expression as the words were translated, his unease, his empathy, his silence. Later, she would remember it as the moment the ground shifted beneath her understanding of the world. That day, the occupation of Germany began not with violence, but with the quiet dismantling of an empire of lies. In Mannheim, 3 one-year-old Gisela Werner, an English-speaking secretary desperate for work, was assigned to assist occupation authorities. Her superior was Lieutenant Marcus Washington, a black officer and lawyer from Chicago. The man who had once fought Nazi divisions now sat behind a desk quoting the Geneva Convention from memory.
Are you quite
At
finished yet?
first, Gisela couldn't meet his
got all day.
eyes.
Just the
Her
names and
schooling
dates,
had
please.
told her that men like him were primitive,
Lieutenant
incapable of
Washington understood the
intellect.
gravity of the situation.
Yet here, he was
signature
composed,
carried the weight of
articulate,
command.
educated. "Ma'am," he said in careful German, "I know what you were taught about people like me,
I hope
but
there is
right
enough bread
now,
for everyone
people
to
are
eat."
hungry. We have a job to do. Can you translate honestly?" She nodded, barely able to speak. That night, in her diary, she wrote, "Everything I believed was a lie." These encounters weren't isolated. They were part of a broader phenomenon historians later called the moral inversion of defeat. Germany had lost the war militarily, but for many civilians, the deeper loss came when they realized that their moral education, their entire worldview, was built on fabrication. The black soldiers' men who had faced racism in their own army became living contradictions to Nazi science. Their discipline, their empathy, their intelligence shattered decades of indoctrination. For Ilse, Marguerite, and Gisela, the war didn't end when the shooting stopped. It ended when they realized that the real enemy had been the ideology inside their own minds. And for the soldiers' men who liberated death camps by day and were denied service in American restaurants by night, the contradiction was just as heavy. They were the victors of one war and the victims of another. But in that spring of 1945, amid rubble and ruin, something radical was born. The simple act of treating one another as human beings. The spring of 1945 was unlike any other in living memory. Germany lay in ruins, cities bombed beyond recognition, bridges twisted into the rivers below, and the once proud Reich now crawling with refugees, orphans, and the displaced. Yet amid the destruction, something more fragile than the infrastructure was beginning to crack belief itself. In towns like Ludwigshafen, Darmstadt, and Augsburg, German civilians came face to face with black American soldiers, and for many, it was the first time they had ever seen a black person in real life. Before that moment, their only exposure came from Nazi propaganda. Pamphlets warning of Negroid degeneracy, school lessons about racial science, and grotesque caricatures showing black soldiers as violent primitives. Now, those same monsters were offering food, medical aid, and water. For most of these soldiers, men of the 761st, 92nd, and 333rd battalions, the contradictions were almost unbearable. They had volunteered or been drafted to fight against Hitler's racist regime, even as their own country segregated them, restricted their promotions, and forced them into separate units. Many had trained in the American South, where whites-only signs marked every restaurant and barracks. Now, those same men were liberating concentration camps and handing out rations to white Germans, former enemies who had been indoctrinated to see them as subhuman. This, historians would later write, was one of the most paradoxical encounters in modern history. Victims of racism extending humanity to the perpetrators of racist ideology. In Fortham, a small town nearly erased by Allied bombing, the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion established a temporary medical aid post. One of its medics, Private Samuel Johnson from Alabama, had already treated hundreds of soldiers in France and Belgium. He'd seen men die under his hands. But now, he found himself tending to frightened German civilians, many of whom refused to let him touch them at first. He would later tell a journalist, "They looked at me like I was a ghost. Some of them wouldn't even meet my eyes, but I kept my voice soft. I told them, pain doesn't care what color a man is. Let me help." One afternoon, an elderly woman spat at him when he approached. Johnson said nothing. He cleaned her wound, wrapped it, and handed her a small vial of penicillin, a substance rarer than gold in those days. The next morning, she returned with her granddaughter, tears streaking her face, and whispered an apology in broken English. That granddaughter, Lottie Holtzman, would grow up to tell her own children, "My grandmother spent her life hating people she'd never met, and one of them saved her life." Not every story ended in reconciliation. There were moments of tension, fear, and mistrust, inevitable in the psychological wreckage of war. Some black soldiers, hardened by the racism of their own army and the horror they had seen in combat, could not bring themselves to trust German civilians. And many Germans, even as they accepted help, clung to fragments of their indoctrination. They took the food, but not the truth. Yet, for a significant number of women, these first encounters became moral awakenings. Marguerite Schiller, the woman who once hid in the farmhouse, later joined an anti-fascist education initiative in Frankfurt, visiting schools to speak about her experience. She would tell classrooms full of children, "I was taught to fear them. I was taught they were beasts. But when the world collapsed, it was one of them who showed me mercy. From that moment, I knew everything I had learned was poison." The impact went far beyond personal transformation. In the years that followed, German society had to confront a new kind of reckoning, not just with the crimes of war, but with the lies that had sustained those crimes. And those lies had been exposed not by ideology, but by human behavior. While trials at Nuremberg judged Nazi leaders for atrocities, the everyday German reckoning came through encounters like these: a soldier sharing a ration bar, a medic treating an enemy's wound, a translator realizing her superior officer was quoting the same laws her own government had ignored. The sociologists who studied post-war Germany would later call this process the humanization of defeat. It wasn't imposed by force. It happened through contradiction, the collapse of an entire worldview when confronted with undeniable decency. Meanwhile, back in Wiesbaden, Ilse Hartmann continued to see the black soldiers from the 761st as they patrolled the area. Her mother still muttered about tests and tricks, but the longer the soldiers stayed, the more their kindness wore down her fear. One morning, the same sergeant who had brought them food, Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell, asked through an interpreter if anyone in town had medical training. Ilse hesitated, then raised her hand. Her father's pharmacy had been destroyed, but she still remembered his lessons. Mitchell smiled faintly. "Then we could use your help," he said. Over the following weeks, Ilse worked alongside the battalion's medics, distributing bandages and antiseptic. She began learning English words from them: "Thank you," "Good job," "Careful." What began as fear transformed into fascination, and then, quietly, into affection. Later, she would write in a letter to her sister. "He looked nothing like the men in our posters. He looked tired, kind, human. For the first time in my life, I saw the enemy, and he looked like hope." By late 1945, fraternization rules were officially enforced by the U.S. Army. Relationships between soldiers and German women were prohibited. But in practice, love did not follow military orders. Across Bavaria, Hesse, and Baden-Württemberg, dozens of relationships blossomed quiet rebellions against two racist systems. For a German woman to love a Black American soldier meant not only defying the Reich's racial purity laws, but also defying America's segregationist military code. It was a double act of resistance, one that both nations would struggle to accept. Records show that by 1946, over 150 marriages between Black servicemen and German women had taken place, despite fierce opposition. And so, in the ashes of Nazi Germany, a generation of children was born children who would later be called occupation babies, symbols of everything both societies had tried to suppress. Ilse and Robert married in 1947. Her mother disowned her. Her neighbors called her a traitor. But in a letter she wrote that year, she said simply, "I would rather betray lies than remain loyal to evil." For many Germans, the war had ended in defeat, but for Ilse and countless others, it was the beginning of something else, a moral rebirth, born not from victory, but from disillusionment. Because when you've spent your life believing that one group of people is less than human, and then one of them saves your child, your city, or your dignity, there's no going back. That was the quiet revolution of 1945. The slow collapse of hatred, one human gesture at a time. By 1946, Germany was a land divided not only by borders and rubble, but by the collision of two moral universes, one that had been taught to believe in racial supremacy, and another that now embodied its total collapse. In every occupied zone, from Bavaria to the Rhineland, the arrival of Black American soldiers continued to chip away at the psychological walls that Nazi Germany had spent 12 years constructing. For women like Ilse Hartmann, Marguerite Schiller, and Gisela Werner, each encounter with the soldiers became a test not of patriotism, but of conscience. They were living through what sociologists later called the crisis of cognition, the realization that the people they had been conditioned to see as inferior possessed the very virtues their own society had claimed: exclusive ownership of discipline, compassion, honor. The effect on German women was profound and deeply personal. They were the ones who interacted most closely with the occupation forces through aid stations, translation work, and food distribution centers. For many, it was the first sustained contact with a world beyond Nazi ideology. These interactions became classrooms where humanity replaced propaganda. Meanwhile, in the United States, back home, newspapers rarely covered the experiences of these Black units. When they did, it was often in short, buried columns beneath headlines celebrating white divisions. Despite their valor, the 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, would not receive a presidential unit citation until decades later. The irony was bitter. These men were liberators abroad, but second-class citizens at home. They could dine in German restaurants, but not in ones back in Georgia. They could command respect from defeated enemies, yet be denied a seat on a bus in their own country. Lieutenant Marcus Washington once told Gisela during a long day of paperwork, "We're here to defeat your racism while living with our own." It was a sentence that haunted her for years. She later wrote in her journal, "It wasn't just Germany that needed re-education. It was the entire world." The occupation forces officially discouraged fraternization, but in practice, enforcement was impossible. Humanity had already broken through the rules. Across Germany, secret romances blossomed behind checkpoints, in canteens, and in quiet corners of ruined cities. These relationships were fraught with danger. For German women, it meant public shame and sometimes violence. For black soldiers, it could mean court-martial. Yet they persisted because love in that time and place was not merely personal. It was political rebellion. Ilsa's letters to Robert Mitchell, written on torn scraps of ration paper, reveal both tenderness and fear. "They stare at us like we're ghosts," she wrote. "But I don't care. You are the first person who treated me like I wasn't an enemy or a lesson, just a person." By the winter of 1946, she and Robert were married in a small church outside Munich. Only 2 witnesses attended, another black soldier and a sympathetic Red Cross nurse. The ceremony was quiet, almost defiant. Her mother refused to come. Her neighbors spat when she passed. But Ilsa felt free for the first time in her life. Sociologists who later interviewed women like Ilsa and Marguerite found a consistent psychological pattern, a 3-step process that mirrored the collapse of authoritarian belief systems. Step 1. Shock. The instant when indoctrination met contradiction, when a monster offered food or mercy. Step 2. Shame. The moral nausea that came from realizing complicity and hatred, even if only through ignorance. Step 3. Transformation. The decision, conscious or not, to reject the false hierarchies that had governed their lives. For some, that transformation became lifelong activism. Margaret Schiller, who once hid trembling in an attic, spent the next 20 years lecturing in schools about the dangers of blind obedience. "I was taught to hate," she told one audience in 1958. "And then I met the people I was supposed to hate. They were the first to treat me as an equal." That is how evil collapses, not by argument, but by example. In America, the story of these encounters was largely forgotten. The country wanted to celebrate victory, not reckon with hypocrisy. The black veterans who returned home were denied the GI Bill benefits that their white comrades received. Many couldn't vote. Some were lynched in uniform. One soldier from the 92nd Division wrote bitterly in a 1947 letter to a friend, "We went overseas to teach the world democracy, but we came back to a country that still can't spell the word." For the German women, the story was equally complex. Their mixed-race children, labeled Mischlingskinder, were ostracized. Many were taken from their mothers and sent to orphanages or adopted abroad. The U.S. government, uneasy with the optics, even arranged for hundreds of these children to be relocated to America in the 1,950 seconds. But no policy could erase what had already happened, the shattering of the racial myth. Each child, each forbidden marriage was a living contradiction to 12 years of Nazi racial science. By 1948, when most black units were withdrawn from Europe, the women who had known them were left to navigate a society eager to forget. Yet, they carried within them a quiet conviction, a conviction that history's greatest victory was not on a battlefield, but in a moment of compassion. For Ilsa, that conviction lasted a lifetime. In 1963, after seeing Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech on television, she wrote a final letter to her sister in Berlin. "When I see Dr. King speak, I think of Robert and the men of the 761st. They fought one war abroad and another at home. They taught me that courage isn't only about fighting the enemy outside, it's about confronting the lies inside your own mind." The generation that followed grew up with different stories. Children like Lotte Holtzman's grandchildren learned from their mothers that hatred was not inherited, it was taught, and what is taught can be unlearned. The occupation archives decades later would reveal thousands of small, unrecorded acts. Rations shared, wounds dressed, dignity restored. Individually, they were tiny gestures. Collectively, they rewrote a nation's moral memory. Germany's physical reconstruction was visible: roads rebuilt, schools reopened, cities rising from ash. But its moral reconstruction was invisible, fragile, and infinitely more important. It began in moments like these, when a frightened young woman met the gaze of a man she'd been told was less than human, and realized she was looking at someone more humane than she had ever been allowed to imagine. The soldiers left. The propaganda faded, the ruins were cleared. But for the women who lived through those days, the lesson never vanished. They had looked into the face of the enemy and seen themselves. The war had ended with surrender. But peace, true peace, began the moment they chose to stop believing the lies. By the early 1950 seconds, the physical wounds of the war had begun to heal, but the psychological ones lingered. Streets bustled again, churches reopened, children played among ruins that still whispered of the past. Yet beneath the surface, an entire generation of German women carried the invisible mark of an ideological collapse, a moral awakening born from defeat. They had survived air raids, hunger, and the downfall of their nation. But the deepest scar came from realizing they had been taught to dehumanize others and had believed it. Now in quiet kitchens and rebuilt schools, these women whispered to their children the truth their teachers never had. That what makes someone human is not race, nor nationality, but conscience. In the years immediately following the occupation, many of those who had interacted with Black American soldiers were still treated as outcasts. A woman like Ilsa Mitchell, formerly Hartman, was viewed as a traitor to her country and her race. The same neighbors who once cheered Nazi parades now whispered behind her back. Her marriage to Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell was not only interracial, it was ideological heresy. When Ilsa gave birth to a daughter, Anna, in 1948, the hospital refused to register the father's name. Her mother never met her granddaughter. But for Ilsa, every obstacle became a quiet act of resistance. She wrote to her sister in Berlin, "They say I betrayed my blood, but my blood was poisoned long before I met Robert. He showed me what being human means." That sentence captured a truth that post-war historians would come to recognize, that the liberation of Germany was not just a military operation, it was a moral education. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Black veterans who had been Germany's unacknowledged teachers faced their own trials. Returning to America, many found that the gratitude of a nation did not extend to them. Signs reading "colored only" awaited them at train stations. Their heroism was invisible to newspapers. The very men who had risked their lives liberating Dachau and Buchenwald were denied service in diners in Alabama and Mississippi. Some of them wrote to their German wives in despair. One letter, preserved in the National Archives, reads, "I fought for freedom twice, once from the Nazis and once for my own country. I'm still fighting." Many of these interracial marriages were rejected by U.S. immigration authorities, forcing the couples to live apart for years. Some women, like Ilsa, never saw America. Others managed to reunite after long legal battles, moving to cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, becoming part of a generation of silent pioneers in the American civil rights struggle. The paradox was cruel. They had escaped one racist system only to confront another. In Germany, their absence left echoes. The occupation children, the mixed-race sons and daughters of Black GIs, and German women became living reminders of both shame and change. Schools refused them, communities ostracized them, and yet their very existence proved the falsehood of racial purity. Lotte Holtzmann, the granddaughter of the woman treated by the Black medic, became a teacher in Stuttgart. In the 1960 seconds, when the civil rights movement began in the United States, She told her students about the day her grandmother spat at a soldier and the soldier who healed her anyway. That man, she said, defeated more than an army. He defeated the hatred inside my family. Her story, like hundreds of others, revealed how empathy had become a weapon more powerful than any gun. By the 1972nd, scholars began to study these encounters systematically. German historians and psychologists coined terms such as Rassenschock, racial shock, to describe the moment Germans realized that their entire worldview had been built on lies. One researcher wrote, "The propaganda died faster than the bombs fell. It took only a single act of kindness to destroy 12 years of ideology." The black soldiers themselves often reflected on the irony of their role. In interviews decades later, veterans of the 761st spoke about how they found more respect in defeated Germany than in victorious America. One veteran, interviewed in 1982, said, "They were supposed to be the enemy, but for the first time in my life, people called me sir and meant it." Another recalled being offered flowers by German children who had been taught he was a monster. "That," he said, "was the first time I believed the war was really over." The ripples of these encounters spread quietly but persistently. Post-war, Germany's gradual rejection of racism, its later embrace of multiculturalism, and its deep-seated commitment to moral responsibility, all of these were shaped, in part, by the cognitive dissonance that began in 1945. When the next generation asked their mothers, "What did you do during the war?" some of them could finally answer, "I learned the truth." Ilsa Mitchell lived long enough to witness the fall of segregation laws in America and the rise of a united Europe. In one of her final letters, written in 1975, she reflected, "They said he was less than human, but he was the first person who ever treated me like one. The war taught me to fear him. Love taught me to forgive myself." The story of these women and soldiers is more than a forgotten footnote of World War II. It is a study in how ideology collapses, not through argument or revolution, but through human contact. A shared meal, a bandaged wound, a word spoken gently, these were the real victories of 1945. History often measures wars by territories gained or lost, but the more profound battles are fought within the mind. For Ilsa, Margarete, Gisela, and thousands of others, the true front line wasn't the Western Front, it was the space between fear and empathy, between indoctrination and awakening. When they crossed that line, they didn't just meet their enemies, they met themselves. The soldiers of the 761st and 92nd Divisions have long since passed. The women who met them are now names in archives and fading photographs. But their encounters remain among the most human moments in all of wartime history, a reminder that compassion, even in the ruins of empire, can rewrite the moral DNA of a nation. Because sometimes the most revolutionary act in a world built on hate is simply to see another person clearly and choose kindness anyway.